And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska aviation weather outlook on this Friday, October 11th, 2024. And we have a lot going on. I want to start out with just this Friday later morning. We have a low pressure center near just south of Sand Point area here off of the Alaska Peninsula, North Pacific side. It's going to bottom out near 950 millibars, and this is a very large low we've been advertising for a long time, since last weekend, early in the week. It has a very broad circulation covering much of the state, the eastern bearing, much of the North Pacific into the Gulf. And it has a frontal system that'll be pushing up into the Gulf as we go through later this Friday and early Saturday. Ahead of it, we have hurricane force wind warnings here for areas, Shelikof, or I should say Kamishak Bay, the entrance there of Cook Inlet, the Barren Islands. And that front is also going to have heavier rainfall along the coast, heavier snows in the mid-upper elevations of the mountains, and that's going to be spreading northeastward along the western Gulf Coast here, the Kenai Peninsula, Prince William Sound, as we go through this Friday evening, Friday night. And then eventually the heavier precipitation will overspread the panhandle on Saturday along with strong gusty winds. We have on the backside of it very strong northeast to north winds along the west side of the state through the Bering Strait, on all the way through St. Lawrence, Matthew, and St. Paul into the especially eastern half of the Aleutians. If that's not enough, multiple weather hazards with high winds, but we also have snow that's going to be developing in overspreading areas, especially as you get up along the interior north of the Yukon River here along the Brooks Range and into the North Slope. There are winter storm warnings. Locally, over a foot of snow could fall. Areas around Anatuvik, Adigan passes, Umiak, and on up and say around Toolik Lake. So those areas there could get some pretty hefty snows as we get into the latter half of Saturday and Sunday morning. So as we go through Saturday morning, low pressure is going to be sitting down here. It's actually going to kind of wobble, dip down to the south, and then pull back toward Kodiak Island later on this weekend. So as of Saturday morning, there could even be some isolated thunderstorms near this low center because it has a lot of lift, a lot of dynamics, but a broad area of IFR conditions along the Gulf Coast, back here toward tip of the Alaska Peninsula. And then for Saturday afternoon, we expect IFR conditions along much of the Gulf Coast into areas of the Panhandle and along the West Arm and the Alaska Range. I would expect the area of snow to be breaking out, and this will likely have to be updated and filled in. Certainly with time, you'll see there by Saturday night into Sunday morning, widespread IFR conditions along the Brooks Range, North Slope, eastern Arctic coast. We continue to see IFR conditions due to low ceilings, areas of moderate to heavy precipitation, though I think the bulk of the precipitation will be working its way across the Gulf Coast into the Panhandle tonight and through the day Saturday. But still, IFR conditions along the Gulf Coast, the inner coastal mountains of the Panhandle. We have areas of the southwest, lower Yukon, lower, middle, even up toward the upper Kuskokwim Valley. So widespread IFR conditions there Sunday morning, and then Sunday afternoon we still have some IFR conditions up into, say, areas of the Copper River Basin, Talkeetna Mountains, especially the southward facing slopes of the Alaska Range, and then along much of the North Slope to the spine of the Brooks Range, including the Arctic coast. And as I said, this system is just going to linger for a while, so it's going to kind of hook back up toward Kodiak Island Sunday, and then gradually work its way eastward and weaken over the lower Gulf through early into the middle of next week. So this system is going to take its time, slowly winding down, but it's at its peak intensity as of this Friday, with still notable impacts through the weekend. So Anatuvik Pass starts out VFR early Saturday, but gets slammed down there with low ceilings, snow, heavy snow, IFR conditions anticipated along with some gusty winds. Same thing, Adigan Pass, VFR early Saturday, then it just shuts down IFR with heavier snowfall, low ceilings, visibilities, all the hazards there you don't want to deal with flying. And then Lake Clark and Merrill stuck in IFR conditions there Saturday. As we come up toward the central Alaska Range, IFR becoming MVFR at Rainy Pass. Right now, windy is forecast to stay VFR, but I'm a bit skeptical of that. Isabel Pass, VFR becoming MVFR. Some of that moisture works its way northward from along the Gulf Coast. and Mentasta Pass VFR early Saturday becoming MVFR. Tenita Pass will see conditions go IFR as would be expected because there's going to be a push of moisture coming up from the south with that particular front. And then for Portage Pass, generally, IFR conditions are anticipated there with the exception of out toward the west entrance. Otherwise, the pass length out into Prince William Sound, IFR Saturday. And Chilkoot and White, as that system, the heavier precipitation moves in from along the Gulf Coast into the Panhandle, you're going to see MVFR conditions quickly go to IFR. And looking at the freezing levels, first at the surface, we find the freezing line into the northern Bering and into areas of the southwest interior and certainly higher elevations of the mountains here, even down into south central. But more notably, with that low in a position around here, we find ahead of the occluded front that's going to be lifting slowly northward, we find freezing levels jump up 8,000 feet over the Panhandle and above 10,000 feet just south there of Haida Gwaii. And of course, with this kind of layout, we have the low here, broad circulation going, affecting the eastern Bering, much of the mainland, the entire Gulf. Along this frontal system and to the backside of the low, we expect moderate icing out over the Gulf Panhandle, 8,000 feet, because again, I showed you those freezing levels aloft are higher. And then along the coast, about 4,000 feet. And then certainly any mountainous areas, you're going to be having to deal with snow. Back out here toward the interior, we're going to see that snow break out and increase in intensity as it lifts northward up through the Brooks Range and into the North Slope. So in this band of development above 2,000 feet could be considerable moderate, even some severe icing. And then on the backside of the system, we find moderate icing across areas of the southwest, southeast Bering, generally above 4,000 feet. So here is the upper level winds, the jet stream level winds, 30,000 feet. We have a jet core ahead of this big circulation. To have the upper low show up this clearly, we find ahead of it 140 knot jet max coming up into the northeastern Gulf Coast, northern parts of the Panhandle. On the backside, over the central Bering, more of a northerly flow, 75 to 85 knots at 700 millibars or 9,000 feet. We see ahead of this system broad area of 50 to 75 knot winds coming in off the North Pacific, Haida Gwaii, southern parts of the Panhandle into British Columbia. And then on the backside circulation just north of the Alaska Range, a strip of 60 knot winds out of the northeast. And this would also lend to turbulent conditions there along the ridge lines and higher elevations of the Alaska Range. And then a broad northerly circulation coming down across the Aleutians at that level of 9,000 feet. But then as we come on down to 3,000 feet, which is just a little, not that far above the surface, we have the low circulation here south of Kodiak Island. And during the day Saturday, some of the strongest low-level winds are going to be along this front. There could be some low-level wind shear associated with that is likely. Higher winds around Haida Gwaii, Dixon Entrance, 50, 60 knots. On the backside, we have just a broad belt of 45 to 60 knot winds along areas of the Chukchi Sea coastline, Point Hope south through the Bering Strait, all along the west coast, Norton Sound, and areas of Nunavik Island south to St. Matthew and St. Paul, down across the eastern Aleutians, where the core of strongest winds. So just a quick sense of where a lot of turbulence, going to be a lot of turbulence, moderate turbulence, large areas across the interior, back along the west coast, into the Aleutians, along the Gulf Coast. But more importantly, we do have areas, and these are just approximations. There could be really, quite frankly, areas of severe turbulence in any sort of gap situation around these areas and any higher terrain. But we find it out here toward the eastern Aleutians, back up through St. George, St. Paul, St. Matthew, even I would say up on the north side there of St. Lawrence. We have a belt of stronger winds along the Yukon River, lower middle Yukon River as you go up. And then here in the Alaska Range, we have high wind advisories, and within the ridge lines and higher peaks, certainly a lot of turbulence around there. And then in the Gulf, broad area of moderate turbulence with some perhaps severe turbulence, southern parts of the Panhandle, Dixon Entrance, and also still lingering in areas of their Kennedy Entrance, the Barren Islands, because this area today, as of Friday, has a hurricane force wind warning for those areas, marine areas. So keep that in mind. But again, with that frontal system lifting slowly northeastward along the Gulf, there will also be the threat of low-level wind shear on Saturday.